Alright, so we're picking back up after cereal grains, and we're going to talk about fiber. Alright, so majority of us are not consuming enough fiber. The mean dietary fiber intake in the United States is about 16 grams. So this is well below the recommendations that I believe, let's see, they're on the next slide here. Wait, that's carbohydrate. Here we go. Sorry. So the recommended dietary fiber intake, WHO actually recommends 25 to 40 grams for all adults. They don't decipher between men and women. But you'll typically see for less than 50 years, for women, they recommend 25 grams of fiber per day, and then for men, 38 grams of fiber per day. So, just for like a side assignment, I would encourage you to, track your fiber intake for a couple days and just see where you get. I think you'd be surprised by if you're not consciously choosing, a ton of vegetables and a ton of legumes and whole grains. Your fiber intake may not be up to par. So it's a good exercise to try. Okay, so coming back here, our carbohydrate recommendations. If you look at, whenever we're creating a meal plan or a macronutrient distribution for an individual, typically we're recommending 45 to 65% of their total caloric intake to come from carbohydrates. So we're suggesting that, a majority of calories should come from carbohydrates. The key here is teaching people to choose the correct carbohydrates. Like we said before, if we're using all these refined carbohydrates, then we're not getting those essential vitamins and fiber that we need in our diet. So the DRI is set at 130 grams a day for anyone older than a year of age, and that is just to achieve adequate function of the central nervous system, red blood cells, who only use glucose as energy. So it's preventing ketosis in most people. But the DRI does not consider exercise and physical activity. So the other issue here is with the added sugars. This is something we've just seen recently, that we're having recommendations for added sugars. So WHO recommends no more than 5% of our calories come from added sugars. The DGAs are a little bit more lenient with, they shouldn't exceed 10%. So I think this will be something that they update more often. This is just another added sugar recommendation from the American Heart Association. Okay, so one of the most important things in this chapter is learning about these glucose transport proteins. So as you can see on the side here, we have GLUT1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 7. You wonder maybe where's GLUT6? Don't worry about it. So basically, we have these glucose transport proteins that are essentially proteins that help to transport glucose in different types of tissues. So you can see on in this column here where these glucose transport proteins are most often found. You see GLUT1 is going to be found in most cells, and it helps to make sure our cells are taking up glucose during hypoglycemia. So remember, hypoglycemia means our blood sugar is low, but what that really means is that there's not a lot of fuel to be taken up. So GLUT1 makes sure that we are able to uptake that glucose that's circulating through the blood into our cells that need it most, right? So to be able to perform those very vital functions in our body. Let's see. So GLUT1 and GLUT4 are probably our most talked about glucose transport proteins. GLUT4 is going to be found especially in cells that are insulin sensitive. So we're talking our skeletal muscle, our adipose tissue, and our cardiac muscle. So if you think about these, our skeletal and our cardiac muscle especially, these are tissues that constantly need energy to be able to contract and help those muscles work, right? Our skeletal muscles need to work. Our cardiac muscles need to work for our bodies to function. So GLUT4 is going to help glucose come into these cells especially. GLUT5 you'll see as your fructose transporter primarily. And then GLUT7 you'll see always has something to do with, our liver cells or our hepatocytes. So GLUT7 has a lot to do with gluconeogenesis or glycogen. Okay, so we'll talk about that a little bit more. This is a chart that you can refer back to. So there is I believe it's a clinical insight in your book that talks about this. Is fructose harmful to health? So you can read about that if you are interested. Okay, so carbohydrate digestion we know always is going to begin in our mouth, right? We have that alpha amylase that helps to break down starches especially. But what we don't always realize is, or that we're not taught yet, is that carbohydrate digestion doesn't particularly like acidic conditions. So as you can see here, our carbohydrate digestion starts in our mouth where it's not incredibly acidic, but once it reaches our stomach, we're not going to have any carbohydrate digestion, virtually none, because of this acidic condition. But once we get back to that small intestine, remember we have those digestive secretions that help to neutralize that acidic pH once our food stuff passes through the duodenum. So carbohydrate digestion can again be initiated in the small intestine. So primarily carbohydrate digestion is going to occur in our small intestine thanks to our pancreas, right? We have that pancreatic amylase secondary to our salivary amylase that's going to help to continue to break down the carbohydrates that we started to sort of prime and digest in our mouth. We also have these enzymes here, this maltase, sucrase, and lactase, and alpha dextrinase as well, in our microvilli, right? Those are, of course, going to digest our monosaccharides. Our monosaccharides. So what's important here is that, especially this lactase, so we have to realize that lactose intolerance isn't an allergy to dairy. It's a intolerance to lactose because we maybe lack this lactase, right? This enzyme that helps to break down lactose. So I just realized I said something earlier. So these enzymes are breaking down disaccharides to form these monosaccharides, basically, not breaking down monosaccharides. So this microvilli you'll see throughout the books, maybe something talking about the brush border. So the microvilli, if you were to kind of flatten it out, it would look like a brush, right? All these tiny little hairs. So these brush border enzymes help to kind of ensure the integrity of that GI tract, the health of it. So lactose intolerance, partly why it causes digestive disruption is because the brush border enzymes, or the brush border is the integrity of it is kind of damaged, and that's what causes some of that discomfort with it. And then again, we are able to ferment, those oligosaccharides in here. So that's what this is showing you here with that. All right. So again, these are your carbohydrate digesting enzymes. So what happens once we've digested those polysaccharides, right? Because the goal is to take these polysaccharides, break them down into smaller monosaccharides or even some disaccharides, and then absorb them, right? Because we want them to go into our cells. We want to be able to use them as energy. So there's two ways that they can be absorbed. Galactose and glucose primarily are going to be absorbed through active transport against a concentration gradient. Fructose, on the other hand, is absorbed by facilitative diffusion. So if you think of, or what you'll learn in your MNT classes later on, is whenever somebody has a low blood sugar, one of the things we recommend is that they drink fruit juice, right? Fruit juice or even soda, which has a high amount of fructose in it. And that's because it's just absorbed so easily and readily. It'll easily pick up their blood sugar right away, but we always have to make sure we're not giving them too much of those things to pick it up, because then we might have to, treat a high blood sugar down the road. So, a little roller coaster there. Okay, so speaking of roller coaster, blood glucose we want to try to keep as stable as possible. In a normal, healthy person, the fasting blood sugar is going to be from 70 to 110. If it's below 70, that's going to be hypoglycemia, and if it's above 110, we would consider that hyperglycemia. So we always have these hormones working, and each four of these is kind of keeping our blood sugar under this homeostasis, right? Insulin and glucagon especially. The role of these counteract each other, but we have to know that at any given time, they're all going to be, moving throughout our bloodstream, right? We're never going to have just insulin, and we're never going to have just glucagon. It's not how our body works. There's a lot of checks and balances in place. So one of your assignments this week is to, you'll be calculating glycemic index and glycemic load of some foods, but also explaining the difference between. So I'm going to let you get to that. But there's lots of good videos on YouTube as well. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the different glucose transport proteins, where they're found, and sort of like what functions they play. So this gives you a little bit more of a synopsis of each. So GLUT1, remember, let's see if I can go back to this one. I'm on slide 27. Okay. So if you remember GLUT1, see here it's telling us that it provides cells with basal glucose requirements. Remember, it's here in most cells, right? So it's ensuring that all of our cells are going to get glucose, even during times of hypoglycemia, right? So GLUT1 is important for all of our cells to just function normally with glucose, right? GLUT2 is active under hyperglycemic conditions. Let's go back to that one. Let's see. In our pancreatic beta cells, let's see. And it has this high Km, and that essentially means that it helps most in times with hyperglycemia. Let's see. GLUT3, active in glucose transport in neurons, and then GLUT4 is expressed in insulin-sensitive cells, like I discussed earlier. GLUT5, like we said, functions as a fructose transporter, so it works super efficiently. And then GLUT7 has a lot to do with glycogen breakdown, gluconeogenesis, all in our liver cells or our hepatocytes. Okay. I am going to start another part of this to get into the major hormones in carbohydrate metabolism. There are about 15 more slides, so I'm going to cover that in part 3.